At 3:12 in the morning, I walked out of the operating room with someone else's heart no longer beating in my hands. The transplant had lasted 6 hours and 18 minutes. My shoulders ached beneath the weight of adrenaline finally draining from my body. The fluorescent lights in the corridor of St. Augustine Medical Pavilion felt harsher than usual, bleaching everything the same sterile white. I pulled my mask down, letting cool air touch my face, and that was when I saw him. My father was standing in the surgical waiting area. He hadn't seen me in 6 years. He stood the way he always did, feet planted, jaw tight, hands gripping the lapels of his navy jacket as if posture alone could control fate. When his eyes lifted, they moved from my face to the badge clipped to my scrubs. Dr. Elena Marino, Chief of Interventional Cardiology. I heard the fabric tear before I understood what I was seeing. His fingers tightened so hard the seam along his side split straight down. That was the moment he realized the daughter he had erased was the only reason his son was still alive. The corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and warmed plastic from the bypass machine. Behind me, a nurse adjusted her clipboard and pretended not to watch. My mother sat 2 chairs away, rosary beads threaded tightly through trembling fingers. Her eyes were swollen, but she was staring at me as if I were both miracle and accusation. "Is he alive?" my father asked. Not Elena, not daughter, just a question thrown like a command. "The transplant was successful," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He's stable. He'll be in the ICU within the hour." My father swallowed. His gaze flicked back to my badge. "You?" I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. The operating room doors were still swinging gently behind me, and every member of the cardiac team knew exactly who had led that surgery. I had disclosed the conflict of interest before we began, documented it in the chart, alerted the ethics committee, called a backup surgeon to stand by in case my judgment faltered. It hadn't. When the donor heart refused to beat for 3 seconds after reperfusion, I didn't think about 6 years of silence. I thought about perfusion pressure and electrical stability. I thought about the oath I took long before my father decided I had shamed the Marino name. My mother finally whispered it. "Elena." It sounded fragile, almost unfamiliar. I caught my father leaning toward her, his voice low but not low enough. "He's all we have." The words landed harder than the torn jacket. "He's all we have," as if I had never existed. I stepped back half a pace, professional distance settling over me like another layer of scrubs. "You'll be able to see him soon," I said. "There will be a long recovery. A transplant isn't a cure, it's a commitment." My father looked at me like he wanted to ask something else, something older and heavier. But pride held it back. Pride had always held it back. 6 years earlier, that same pride had cut me out of this family in a phone call that lasted 3 minutes and 27 seconds. If you want to understand what happened in that operating room tonight, you have to understand what happened at our kitchen table the day my brother decided I was a threat. 6 years earlier, the lie that erased me didn't begin in a hospital. It began at my parents' kitchen table on a humid Sunday afternoon in Sarasota. We were having one of my mother's usual dinners, pasta, red sauce simmering since morning, windows open to let in the Gulf breeze. Gabriel was at the head of the table beside my father, talking about a waterfront development deal he was this close to closing. He had always known how to fill a room. I had just received confirmation that I'd been accepted into the interventional cardiology program at Johns Hopkins. Baltimore felt a world away from Sarasota, but for the first time in my life, it felt like my world. My father lifted his wine glass and cleared his throat. The room quieted instantly. He looked at me. Not past me, not through me, but at me. "Maybe one of my children," he said slowly, "will carry the Marino name into something bigger." It was the closest thing to praise he had ever given me. I felt the shift before anyone else did. Gabriel smiled and raised his glass in a toast, but his fingers tightened around the stem. The smile stayed on his mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. At the time, I thought it was nothing more than bruised pride. I didn't know he had just lost a major investor on his condo development downtown. I didn't know my father had quietly extended him a private family loan to keep the project afloat. I didn't know how much of our family's identity was tied to Gabriel being the successful one. A few weeks later, during my second year of residency, everything changed. Mateo's health had been declining for months. 7 years old, cystic fibrosis. The son of my best friend who had died too young. I had finalized legal guardianship through the Hillsborough County Court. I had the paperwork, the judge's signature, the embossed seal. He was my son in every way that mattered. When his lungs worsened and the transplant team recommended aggressive intervention, I filed for an official 8-month leave of absence. The hospital approved it. My residency slot was protected. Everything was documented, transparent, legitimate. I called Gabriel the night it was finalized. I told him everything about the guardianship, about the leave, about the apartment I'd rented in Tampa to be closer to the children's hospital, about how scared I was. He was quiet for a long moment. "Dad won't understand this," he said softly. "I have the paperwork," I replied. "There's nothing to misunderstand." A week later, my father called. The call lasted 3 minutes and 27 seconds. Gabriel had shown them proof, he said. Screenshots, emails. Messages that proved I had dropped out of my program, that I was drowning in debt, that I was living off a sick child's insurance money instead of facing my responsibilities. "Tell me this isn't true," my father demanded. "It isn't," I said. "I filed a legal leave. I can send the documents. I can give you my director's number." "You embarrassed this family," he said, his voice turning cold. "Don't call this house again until you're ready to tell the truth." My mother never spoke. Within 72 hours, my number was blocked. I made 11 calls in 5 days. I sent 3 emails with scanned copies of the guardianship order and hospital approval. I mailed a certified letter with every document enclosed. It came back unopened. My mother's handwriting was on the envelope. That was the moment I understood this wasn't confusion. It was a choice. I was sitting outside Mateo's ICU room when Gabriel's text came through. "I'm sorry it had to happen this way." The hallway lights hummed overhead. Machines inside the room pulsed in uneven rhythm with my son's breathing. I read the message 3 times, searching for regret in a sentence that felt rehearsed. Over the next 5 days, I tried to fix what he had broken. 11 calls, I counted them. The first 3 went straight to voicemail. By the 4th, my father's line had blocked me. My mother followed 2 days later. I left messages anyway. Calm at first, then firmer, then simply factual. I sent 3 emails with attachments. Guardianship order from Hillsborough County, official leave approval from Johns Hopkins, contact information for my residency director. I wrote the subject line clearly. Documentation attached. Please read. There was no reply. I mailed a certified overnight envelope with copies of everything. 5 days later, it returned to my Tampa apartment. Unopened, my mother's handwriting curved across the front in black ink. Return to sender. That was when something inside me went quiet. The rumors began almost immediately. A cousin from Naples called under the guise of concern. "We heard you're taking some time to get help," she said carefully. "Help for what?" A family friend mentioned she'd heard I had left medicine because of financial trouble. Someone else implied I was using Mateo's illness to access insurance money. The story had grown teeth. It wasn't just that I had dropped out. Now I was unstable, desperate, investigated. Only one person had every private detail required to build that version of me. Gabriel. Mateo's condition worsened while my reputation unraveled. His oxygen levels dropped. His small chest worked harder for every breath. I sat beside his bed, memorizing the sound of his inhalations, knowing each one cost him effort. I thought about driving to Sarasota, walking into my parents' house with the court order in my hand. I didn't go. Mateo needed me more than I needed vindication. The transplant came and failed. Acute rejection. Complications no one could control. I stood in a hospital room in Clearwater while monitors flattened into a single unbroken tone. I held his hand until it cooled beneath mine. 6 people attended the funeral. A nurse from the children's unit, 2 colleagues, a neighbor, the chaplain. No Marino family. I read the eulogy without crying. There was nothing left in me that could spill. Afterward, I unfolded the drawing he had given me weeks earlier. Stick figures, 1 tall, 1 small, a red heart between us. "Mom fights hearts," he had written in uneven letters. That night back in my apartment, I framed the drawing and placed it on my desk. I told myself I would finish what I started. The next morning, a certified letter waited at my door. Florida Medical Board. An anonymous complaint had been filed against me alleging misuse of charitable funds and fraudulent guardianship claims. The timing was precise, 1 week after my father cut contact. I stared at the envelope, Mateo's drawing in my other hand. Losing my family had hurt. Losing my son had shattered me. But someone was trying to erase my career too. And that wasn't grief. That was strategy. I went back to Baltimore 3 weeks after Mateo's funeral because staying still felt like surrender. The residency director at Johns Hopkins met me in his office without hesitation. He had already seen the complaint that circulated quietly through professional channels. He didn't look suspicious. He looked tired. "Your leave was fully approved," he said, sliding the paperwork across the desk. "We stand by that." That sentence anchored me. I threw myself into work the way some people throw themselves into prayer. 12-hour shifts turned into 14. I volunteered for research trials no one else wanted. I memorized hemodynamic charts until numbers replaced thoughts. But the complaints didn't stop. The Florida Medical Board eventually labeled the first allegation unsubstantiated. A few months later, another one appeared, this time accusing me of falsifying transplant data. The timing was deliberate, filed the same week I was scheduled for my board certification review. It didn't feel random anymore. Daniel Hayes entered my life during that second investigation. He was a medical ethics attorney consulted by the hospital to review the complaint's validity. He listened more than he spoke. When I handed him the returned certified letter from my parents and the metadata from the altered screenshots Gabriel had shown them, he didn't react emotionally. "This isn't impulsive," he said quietly. "This is structured." He began tracing patterns I hadn't had the bandwidth to see. The complaints were always filed just before a professional milestone. Each one required me to respond, to document, to defend. It wasn't about winning. It was about wearing me down. The third complaint nearly cost me my eligibility for a leadership appointment in Tampa. By then, I had accepted a position at St. Augustine Medical Pavilion to help rebuild their interventional cardiology program. It was struggling when I arrived. Within a year, survival rates improved, funding stabilized, and my name appeared on donor plaques in the cardiology wing. The same week I was nominated for chief of cardiology, another anonymous allegation surfaced. Daniel requested a deeper digital audit. The trace logs came back 2 weeks later. The IP addresses linked to a commercial server registered to Marino Coastal Developments in Sarasota, Gabriel's company. The complaints hadn't come from a grieving brother worried about my judgment. They had originated from a corporate network he controlled. Daniel compiled everything: IP logs, timestamp comparisons, software signatures used to alter the screenshots. He laid the file out on our kitchen table one evening in Tampa. "You can file a defamation suit tomorrow," he said. "We have enough." I looked at the evidence, at the meticulous architecture of deception, and felt something unexpected. Not fury, clarity. If I sued now, it would become spectacle. Headlines, depositions, public fracture. "Not yet," I said. Daniel studied me for a moment and nodded. "Then we wait." Weeks later, my Aunt Lucia called. Her voice was lower than usual. "Gabriel collapsed at a charity gala," she said. "They think it's his heart." I stood in my kitchen overlooking Tampa Bay, the evidence folder heavy in my hands. For 6 years he had tried to stop my career from beating. Now his own heart was failing, and I was the only cardiologist in Tampa qualified to handle what was coming. The pager went off at 3:12 in the morning. Daniel stirred beside me as the sharp vibration cut through the quiet of our bedroom. The house overlooked Tampa Bay, moonlight stretching silver across the water, peaceful and indifferent. I was on my feet before I was fully awake. Level 1 cardiac emergency. Male, 39. Acute decompensated heart failure. Transplant candidate. I dressed without thinking, muscle memory, years of early calls and fragile lives depending on steady hands. Daniel sat up, watching my face as I scanned the message. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said. The drive to St. Augustine Medical Pavilion was nearly empty at that hour. Streetlights blurred past as I ran through protocols in my head. Donor status, perfusion timelines, surgical team readiness. If a compatible heart was available, we would move fast. When I badged into the cardiac ICU, the air felt sharper than usual. Nurses were already in motion. A resident handed me a tablet with the digital chart open. I glanced down. Gabriel Marino. For 1 second, the hallway went silent in my ears. Dilated cardiomyopathy, severe deterioration, ventricular function collapsing. Without transplant, survival window measured in hours. I inhaled once and stepped into the room. He looked smaller than I remembered. Oxygen mask fogging faintly. Skin pale beneath hospital lights. Machines mapped the failing rhythm that used to carry his confidence through every room. I turned to the charge nurse. "Initiate transplant protocol. Page Dr. Patel as backup. I'm declaring conflict of interest in the chart." The words were automatic, clear, documented. The ethics committee would be notified. If at any point my judgment wavered, another surgeon would take over. A nurse leaned closer. "His parents are on their way." Of course they were. The donor heart had already been approved for transport. Timing was tight but viable. We didn't have the luxury of hesitation. As we prepped him for surgery, my parents arrived. I saw them through the glass doors of the waiting area. My father moved quickly despite his age, jaw tight, coat thrown over pajamas. My mother clutched her purse like it might steady her. He didn't recognize me at first, behind mask and cap. "I need the chief cardiologist," he demanded. The nurse gestured toward me. "She's already here." I stepped forward to review consent documentation. I lowered my mask briefly so he could see my face. Silence fell hard between us. "You?" he said. "He needs immediate transplant," I replied. "We have a compatible donor. We're moving now." My father looked like he wanted to argue with the universe, but there was no room for pride inside a failing heart. As they signed the forms, I heard him whisper to my mother, not quietly enough, "He's all we have." The words struck, but I didn't let them linger. In the operating room, the world narrowed to precision. We opened his chest, initiated cardiopulmonary bypass, removed the diseased heart that had betrayed him. The donor organ arrived cooled and protected, fragile but strong. When we connected the final sutures and restored blood flow, the new heart hesitated. 3 seconds. 4. Dr. Patel stepped closer, ready. I adjusted pressure and pacing, refusing to blink. The heart caught. A steady rhythm filled the room. 6 hours and 18 minutes after we began, I placed the final stitch. He was alive. And for the first time in 6 years, the Marino name rested in my hands. I walked into the waiting room still wearing my surgical scrubs. My mask hung loose around my neck. My hair was pulled back tightly. My badge rested against my chest, visible under the fluorescent lights. My father stood the second he saw me. "Well?" he demanded. "The transplant was successful," I said evenly. "He's stable in the ICU. The next 24 hours are critical, but the surgery went as planned." My mother exhaled like something inside her had finally loosened. "Elena," she whispered, as if testing whether the name still belonged to me. My father's eyes dropped to my badge again. He looked at it longer this time. "Chief of Interventional Cardiology." "We didn't know," he said. I held his gaze. "You didn't want to know." The words weren't sharp. They were steady. Before he could respond, Daniel stepped forward from the far side of the corridor. He had been quiet all night, observing. Now he carried the slim leather folder I had seen so many times on our kitchen table. He introduced himself simply, Daniel Hayes, Elena's husband. My father flinched almost imperceptibly at that word. Would you like to understand what actually happened 6 years ago? Daniel asked calmly. My father hesitated, then nodded once. Daniel opened the folder and handed him a certified copy of the guardianship order from Hillsborough County. Embossed seal. Judge's signature. Official documentation that Mateo had been legally mine. He placed the next document in my mother's hands. The Johns Hopkins leave of absence approval, signed and dated before my father ever made that phone call. She never dropped out, Daniel said. The residency director confirmed that in writing. My mother's hands trembled as she traced the raised seal on the paper. Daniel continued without raising his voice. He slid forward printed screenshots, original email headers beside altered versions Gabriel had shown them years ago. Metadata comparisons highlighted in yellow. These are the edited files, he explained. Here are the originals. The modifications are time-stamped. My father's jaw tightened. What are you saying? Daniel turned one more page. Anonymous complaints filed with the Florida Medical Board originated from a corporate server registered to Merino Coastal Developments. Silence fell heavy and complete. My father stared at the page as if it might rearrange itself into something easier. I sent 11 calls, I said quietly. 3 emails, 1 certified letter. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth. We moved to the ICU when Gabriel regained partial consciousness. He was pale, weak, but aware. My parents stepped inside first. I remained near the door. Is it true? My father asked him. Gabriel looked between them, searching for ground. I was protecting the family, he said hoarsely. She was making reckless choices. Daniel stepped closer and placed one final document on the tray table beside the bed. An internal company email instructing an assistant to file the complaint anonymously. Gabriel's name signed at the bottom. The room went still. I didn't think it would go this far, Gabriel muttered. My father moved toward the window, shoulders shaking in a way I had never seen before. For the first time in 6 years, no one interrupted me. Tonight is about his recovery, I said calmly. The rest will be addressed later. My father turned back toward me, his voice stripped of command. Elena, what do we do now? Saving his heart had been surgery. Repairing this family would require something far more invasive. Daniel laid out the options the morning after Gabriel's surgery. We were sitting at our kitchen table, the same place where he had organized evidence for months without ever pushing me to use it. The folder was open again, thicker now with confirmed IP traces, authenticated metadata, and documentation of every complaint filed against my license. You can sue, he said calmly. Defamation, professional damages. You have grounds for civil liability. He wasn't exaggerating. The investigations had cost me time, money, and nearly a leadership position. Gabriel's brokerage license could be reviewed. His company reputation could collapse. For a long moment I watched the early light move across Tampa Bay outside our window. I don't want him destroyed, I said finally. I want the lie dismantled. Daniel nodded once. Then you set conditions. I met my parents first, without Gabriel. We sat in a small conference room at the hospital. Neutral ground. My father looked older than he had 24 hours earlier. My mother avoided my eyes at first. I'm not filing a lawsuit, I began, but there will be terms. My father stiffened slightly. First, I said, Gabriel sends a written correction to every family member and business partner he misled. In writing, clear and specific. My mother nodded quickly. My father remained silent. Second, he signs a legally binding cease and desist agreement. If any further defamation occurs, I will pursue it immediately. And third, I added, you both attend family therapy for 6 months. My father exhaled sharply. We don't air family matters to strangers. You aired mine to everyone, I replied evenly. The room fell quiet. After a long pause, my mother placed her hand on his arm. "Jerry," she whispered. He looked at me, pride warring with reality. "Fine," he said at last. Gabriel asked to meet me privately 2 days later. He was still pale from surgery, the long incision hidden beneath hospital fabric. For the first time in my memory, he looked unsure. "I was losing control," he admitted. "The development was collapsing. Dad was questioning me. You were succeeding." "And that threatened you," I said. He didn't deny it. "I thought if they believed you'd failed," he continued, "it would stabilize everything." "By destabilizing me," I replied. He swallowed. "Would you have saved me if you'd known everything before the surgery?" I held his gaze. "I'm a cardiologist. I don't let personal history stop a transplant." He nodded slowly. The email went out 3 days later. 3 paragraphs. No excuses. He acknowledged altering screenshots, filing anonymous complaints, maintaining the lie for 6 years. He stated clearly that I had never abandoned the family. The responses rippled quietly. Some cousins called to apologize, others stayed silent. Trust doesn't shatter loudly, it evaporates. My father called me alone a week later. "I should have verified," he said. "I chose what was easier to believe." "You missed my wedding," I reminded him gently. His voice broke. "I know." Therapy began the following month in West Tampa. We didn't hug dramatically. We didn't pretend the damage hadn't happened. But something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't asking to be believed. I was being heard. The ballroom lights felt warmer than the operating room ever did. 200 people filled the Hartford Marquise Hotel that night. Cardiologists, board members, donors, nurses who had stood beside me at 3 in the morning more times than I could count. Crystal glasses chimed softly as conversations drifted between tables. Daniel sat at my right, steady as always. Across the room, near the back row, my parents sat side by side. Not at the front, not beside me. In the back, where they chose to be. When my name was announced, Florida Cardiologist of the Year, the applause rose slowly, then fully. I stood smoothing the simple black dress I had chosen for the evening and walked to the podium. 5 years ago, I might have searched the room for my father's approval. That night, I didn't need to. "I almost left medicine once," I said into the microphone. "Not because I couldn't do the work, but because I lost the people I thought I needed in order to keep going." The room quieted. What I learned is that integrity outlasts rumor, structure outlasts noise, and the heart survives because it is supported by discipline. I glanced briefly toward the back row. My mother's eyes were wet. My father's hands were folded tightly in his lap. "Sometimes," I continued, "the people who believe you come later than you hoped. What matters is that you build a life strong enough to stand whether they arrive or not." The applause felt different when I stepped away from the podium, not louder, just earned. After the gala, my father approached Daniel near the coat check. I watched from a distance. "I should have been the one walking her down the aisle," he said quietly. Daniel extended his hand. "You can't rewrite that day, but you can show up for the next one." A week later, therapy continued. Hard conversations, no dramatics. My father admitted he equated obedience with loyalty. My mother acknowledged that silence can wound just as deeply as accusation. Gabriel attended separately, rebuilding his reputation one honest transaction at a time. Healing didn't look cinematic, it looked consistent. On the first Sunday of spring, my parents came to our house in Tampa for breakfast. Morning light poured across the kitchen floor. Daniel was grinding coffee. The air smelled like cinnamon and toasted bread. My father stood awkwardly near the doorway. "You can set the table," I told him. He opened the cabinet carefully, removed 4 plates, and counted them aloud under his breath. 4. Not the family we used to be, the one we are choosing to become. We ate quietly at first. No speeches, no declarations, just presence. I didn't win by destroying anyone. I won by refusing to let someone else define my truth. If you've ever been cut off because of someone else's lie, if you've ever rebuilt your life without applause, I'd love to know what you would have done in that operating room. Would you have opened that door again? Leave your answer in the comments. Share your story. And if this journey resonated with you, if you believe strength doesn't always look loud, stay with this channel. Subscribe, and let's keep building lives that no one else gets to erase. Because truth may take years to arrive, but when it does, it doesn't whisper. It takes a seat at your table. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact,